With every beginning, there is an end, and with every end, there is a new beginning. Dragon's Dogma 2 is just around the corner, and my journey with Dragon's Dogma is nearing its end. After 12 years, I have decided to voice my opinions on what has made this game something absolutely phenomenal for me, what actually lured me in the first place, and why I feel like it had a couple features that were ahead of its time, though underappreciated by many, including myself, until I've taken the time to look back and reflect upon it. So, without further ado, join me on my final journey into Gransys. My first foray into Dragon's Dogma was in the demo, after it was recommended to me by Demolition D from the PlayStation forums back in the tail end of 2011. He told me it was something to watch out for. I ended up playing that demo where you do the tutorial or you can fight a griffin outside of Gran Soren. I can say safely that both instances very much captivated me and left me wanting for more. It gave me a taste of the combat, and it let me see a couple things that I never was able to recreate in the actual game myself afterwards, which is almost funny to think about. Pawns actually using their springboard moves to throw me onto the griffin, or actually catching me when I fall. That's something I personally haven't seen in 12 years with my time in the game. But after trying out the demo, I unfortunately had to take some time to save up a little bit of money and was not able to get the game on launch. I did, however, buy it maybe a month or two after launch, and immediately its hooks were set in. The game has a bit of a goofy story, and the combat definitely starts slow, but it grows on you, and there are multiple things that I still think to this day were slightly ahead of its time, but at the time many people, including myself, underappreciated it. So let's begin exploring the game with a touch on its story. The story in Dragon's Dogma first appears to be just your generic high fantasy RPG. You start as a chosen one, and the story unfolds around you mostly through cutscenes. However, there is one thing that I feel most players miss because we're all trying to seek the highs of the combat that Dragon's Dogma presents. There are NPCs that you can talk to in the game that provide background context for the world and for a little bit of lore. For example, if you talk to Iola in Cassardis early in the game, you can learn that Duke Edmund should be of the same age of her. When you meet the Duke, he still looks like a man in his 30s or 40s instead of a man towards the twilight of his life. It's fascinating the little details that can be missed if you don't actively seek them out. There are other lore details, such as the fact that there have been goblin wars, or why the Dragon Forged never exactly defeated the dragon, such as the fact that he never believed in anyone but himself, so he threw everything away and sought only power. In the end, it was his downfall. Many players won't know that, and they'll assume that he, as well as the Duke, did something that you have a choice for yourself. But that's not entirely the case if you take the time to talk to the NPCs. It could have been presented better overall, and there are definitely points that almost make no sense. I feel like a fair comparison for the story would be something akin to Wheel of Time, wherein souls seem to be reincarnated time and time again throughout an eternal cycle. And there are other parallels between the Wheel of Time, but I can't necessarily get into everything without too many spoilers. I actively encourage you to seek out NPCs and talk to them, whether it's your first playthrough or your 95th playthrough like so many of us. You'll possibly learn something new and possibly learn something fascinating about the world that you may not have known or other people have not touched upon. This leads me on to my next topic, exploration. Dragon's Dogma is a beautifully crafted world, and boy oh boy does it show. There are many areas and vistas that look phenomenal. However, most players may never see them, especially in the southern area of Gransys. Most main quests do not go down toward that area, and only a few side quests do. However, I feel that the areas are worth exploring because there are many places that you can gather equipment early on that you may not be able to get until later in the game. Exploration is rewarded with gear, with items, and with certain enemy encounters that can be quite challenging and fun that you may never have seen otherwise if you did not take the time to explore. Although exploration is a point of contention for many players, the common criticism is that exploring takes far too long, going across the map at such a slow pace. However, Dragon's Dogma alleviates this with its very own unique fast travel system, the usage of port crystals. In the original version of Dragon's Dogma, you only received one when you encountered the Griffin at Blue Moon Tower. However, in the Dark Arisen version and the expansion, this was upgraded to 5 different port crystals that you can get per playthrough. You can place these anywhere in the world that you desire, and then you can simply use a Fairy Stone or the Eternal Fairy Stone that was added with Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen to travel to the point. This unique system is absolutely phenomenal. I cannot think of any other game at the time that allowed you to do such a thing. Yes, other games may have had fast travel, but they didn't allow you to set the point that you wanted to go to personally. So if there was an area you were farming for a specific enemy, you could put a port crystal near them so that you could rest at an inn and then port back and fight them again to get the items you required. Or maybe there was a specific area you thought was beautiful and you wanted to visit it every now and then. You could set a port crystal there as well. Or, as in the use case for myself with speedrunning, you can set it up in a certain sequence to make the runs go so much smoother and be able to speed up certain portions of the game to save time. So while exploration may initially be a bit of a dreadful thing, eventually, once you have your port crystal network set up, it becomes a breeze. There's also the factor that there are consumable items everywhere that you can use to recover your stamina, which I know goes against the ethos of many of us, in that we want to hoard every single item, especially consumables, until the moment we actually need them. Dragon's Dogma changes this by making it so that when you're running out of combat and not in a town, you use stamina. So what's the trade-off here? Are you going to keep running and not use a consumable, or are you going to use a consumable so you can keep running? Or are you going to save that consumable for when you're going to encounter a group of enemies? Eventually, you find a balance on what you want to do with this, and it's something that, again, people who have a criticism of exploration and of the stamina system seem to neglect. There are bountiful options to alleviate this issue. Moving onward, however, quests also have a bit of a unique flair to them as well. Most people seem to think that they're not necessarily that great or that they stand out at all. I actually disagree a little bit in that aspect. Some of the quests in the game can be tackled in various ways. A very, very early example and a very hard wall for a lot of players is the fact that Lost and Found is given to you early, which is a quest to find Kina in the Witchwood. If you go there immediately after you get the quest and try to go in the daytime, you'll encounter bandits who will absolutely wipe the floor with you. They've done it to me multiple times, whether it's on normal mode or hard mode. However, if you decide to make the trek at night, you'll only encounter wolves, and it'll be much easier to go toward the Witchwood. The trade-off then is that instead of only facing wolves in the Witchwood, you'll also face phantoms. However, they are much easier to deal with than the strength that the bandits possess at this point in the game. This is something that unfortunately turns a lot of people off because you just go to an area where you think you should be going and you get absolutely smothered. This happens a couple times throughout the game, and usually it's the bandit enemies. For some reason, they are tuned a bit differently than other enemies and a bit of a pain. But this isn't the only quest where you can have multiple options with. For example, later quests in the game, you're asked to recover something for the Duke. You can choose to give the item back, or you can make a forgery for it at the Black Cat and keep the item for yourself to receive its benefits, which is basically a free augment on you or your pawn. You can do this for multiple quests, and there are slight variations. It's nothing groundbreaking like we have seen in other games, but there's still a little more variation to it than I feel most people are willing to admit. The quests, combined with Dragon's Dogma's strongest point, however, make for quite a unique experience. The strongest point obviously being the combat. There are 9 different vocations. We have a class with a bow and daggers, another class with a bigger bow and daggers, another class with a magical bow and daggers, another one with bows, daggers, and swords. Oh my! Then we have fighter and better fighter. Then we have mage and better mage, and the red-headed stepchild of warrior. Now that I've gotten a little bit of a joke out of the way, the combat is actually relatively well crafted. The game starts out very slowly. You attack and you don't do much at all. Slowly, you build up skills through learning them via defeating enemies, gaining discipline points, gaining experience, changing your gear, and it starts flowing together. Now, a lot of people put off pawns, but when you're in a flow of combat, and this is really the strongest point of it, in the mid-game, and potentially before you get to the DLC, you're not killing everything instantly. You're taking care of certain enemies, your pawn's taking care of other enemies. You start learning enemy weak points, you can defeat them faster, and you combine it with skills that you enjoy using, whether that's the absurdly powerful Fracture Dart or Skull Splitter, to Magic Cannon, Ruinous Sigil, Bolide, Maelstrom, Giselle, whatever it is, there is a skill out there that you can enjoy. You do not, and I want to put emphasis on this, do not have to min-max your character in this game. It is very often cited, unfortunately, that to play certain vocations, you have to play another vocation exclusively. These usually being Assassin or Sorcerer, so that you max out your attack or magic. This is not true. And I just want to repeat that. That's not true at all. You can play whatever you want, whenever you want. It is advisable to try out every single vocation to see what suits your fancy, and because every vocation has augments that they can unlock, which passively improve your character. So, for example, Warrior will give you an augment eventually that lets you have 20% more strength. Sorcerer will do the same with magic. Experiment a bit. Try what you want, have fun. The combat in this game, once it clicks, is phenomenal. It starts slow, but my gosh, once you get a feel for it, once you know enemy weak points, and once you find that sweet, sweet combination, it just flows and pulls you in. That right there is the main draw of Dragon's Dogma for, I'd say, the overwhelming majority of those who have played it. There's just something special and unique about it, and I am so looking forward to the improvements that they've made on the progression in Dragon's Dogma 2. It also cannot be understated, the fact that Dragon's Dogma allows you to climb most large monsters is a phenomenal feature. However, it is not without its flaws. The camera inverts itself at times, and the controls tend to be a little all over the place. However, it is still a unique feature for Dragon's Dogma that not many other games have attempted to nor accomplished at the level that Dragon's Dogma did. And one of the more fascinating systems that also applies with combat are the pawns. Pawns are myrmidons unique to the Arisen that they can command. Most players seem to be on one of two sides when it comes to pawns. They either adore them and their goofy nature and the lines that are quoted very, very often within communities, or they absolutely hate them. And both sides do have very valid points. Pawns can be phenomenal when they are trained correctly. However, the method for training pawns is rather obtuse and still to this day is being explored by quite a few people. And pawns can easily be absolutely worthless or goofy. They were based off of data used of players from the time period in online games. So while they may seem extremely goofy and unreliable, I can definitely say with personal experience that they are not that far off from some of the people I would see in multiplayer lobbies back in the day. And granted, some of them still exist in multiplayer games to this day. But it is a very unique system that allows you to have a companion that can serve whatever role you need them to do, whether it be a tank, whether it be a damage dealer, whether it be a support. And unfortunately, many players just never interact with the system whatsoever because they're told pawns are worthless. Pawns can kill everything in the game just as well as a risen, with some exceptions, and it's a shame that so many people put them aside just because of misconceptions from others that have stated that they no longer need them. Hopefully, Dragon's Dogma 2 makes it a little less obtuse so that people can actually get general usage out of pawns and cover the parts of their party that are lacking. And while I am talking about combat, it would be very remiss of me to not mention the sound design of Dragon's Dogma. Without the sound design, I don't feel the combat would be as impactful as it is. There are different tracks for different encounters, whether the enemy is far below you, a threat to you, or an extreme threat, although the latter seems to be very, very uncommon to trigger. There's also the design on the hits of the monsters, the hits on weak points, the hits when you use your arrows, the sound of blast arrows, the sound of magic. It's just absolutely phenomenal and top tier. So why not take a bit of a listen and see what I mean? Now, while I have been praising many aspects of Dragon's Dogma, there are some issues that I would like to address personally. The first one that comes to mind is the accessibility of the expansion Dark Arisen. You can almost immediately access it, and this can tamper with the new player experience, as many veterans and YouTubers alike state that you must go to Bitter Black Isle to have fun in the game. This is simply not true, and it ruins the entire gear progression for the game and makes the main game laughably easy, and you see no progress in your character if you try to tackle it with Bitter Black Isle gear. There is also the fact that Bitter Black is considered the endgame of the entire experience, and unfortunately many new players go directly there because there's a quest marker, it's easy to access, and they end up fighting enemies that kill them in 1 or 2 hits, and suddenly the game experience gets worse. They can't damage the enemy, and they're dying quickly. But at the same time, they are led to believe, I have to be here because if I don't do this, I'm not going to have fun with the game. Again, that is not entirely true. The fact that it's so easily accessible early in the game can be off-putting and is something I've heard complained about many times as a reason why someone has quit the game. And unfortunately, it's done, it's over with. Capcom made the decision to do it that way, but hey, it is what it is. Although that's not the only thing in the early game that is very, very off-putting. There's also the quest Off With Its Head, which is a mandatory main story quest where you have to escort an ox carrying a Hydra head. This quest, on average, takes about 14 minutes, and on the speedrun side of things, it takes on average about 4.5 minutes. This quest being so early in the game and mandatory is insanely off-putting. The amount of people I have heard say that they quit the game when they got to the ox cart because they have no sense of exploration. They're forced to do this boring escort quest that isn't necessarily all that engaging. It's such a glaring issue, and with the previews we've seen of Dragon's Dogma 2, we already see Talos. I sincerely hope that that quest is optional, or if there are multiple new game cycles again, which I assume that there are, that you can circumvent it, or that it gets faster versus constantly having to deal with a very drawn-out sequence in a game. There is also the fact that while exploration can be a bit rewarding when you find gear and items, the world, while vast, is relatively dead. Once you learn where enemy spawns are, those enemies are always going to be there. Nothing changes, and unfortunately, not much really does throughout the game. Eventually, griffins will spawn in the world, but they're so rare and they rarely decide to fight the player, and it's a missed experience outside of the quest Griffin's Bane. They get replaced by the cockatrice almost immediately if you push the story too quick, so you almost never fight them. The post-game does change the world a bit, but again, once you learn where the enemy spawns are, it's nothing really special. Once you've seen it all, you know everything. You know where goblins will spawn, wolves will spawn, dire wolves will spawn. You know where the ambushes will be. Unfortunately, that is one of the weakest areas of it, along with how long it typically takes to actually set up a port crystal network the first time you play through the game. It's rewarding once it's set up, however, getting to that point is a bit of a frustrating thing for many players, and not everyone enjoys the fact that you might have to take 15 or 20 minutes to travel from one part of the map to the other for a quest just because it's set that way, you know? And it's something that I hope Dragon's Dogma 2 improves on, that there's more cohesion in the world, it has more enemies in it, it has more events in it, and it's more lived in and lively. That was one of the weaknesses of Dragon's Dogma. And while there are 9 listed vocations in the game, Quite a few of them have a bit of overlay. Again, as I made a bit of a joke earlier, there are 4 classes that use a variant of bows and daggers. They share a lot of similar skills, and honestly, I am glad for the separation in Dragon's Dogma 2 that will actually give us unique vocations rather than copies. This time, there's no copy of a fighter, there's no copy of a strider, and sorcerer and mage actually have different abilities this time. Imagine that. There's also the lovely fact that the pawn system is obtuse. You're not told what anything actually means when you're creating your pawn, and you kind of have to figure out what inclinations do, otherwise you look them up on the internet and see, oh, well, I've made my pawn pretty horrible. But the game doesn't tell you anything about that, and it's a huge reason why people think pawns are a terrible thing, because most of us unintentionally make terrible pawns. And it is at no fault of the player, as the systems honestly are not explained whatsoever. And once again, tying into the early game, the combat does start out extremely slow. You unlock skills very slowly because you don't earn too many discipline points. You level up very quickly. So while you are incentivized to try out other vocations to earn their augments as passives for yourself, most players will finish the game having only played 1 or 2. This is simply because there are 9 vocation ranks, and you typically don't get the items that increase the rate at which you earn your discipline until you hit the post-game or you do Bitter Black Isle. This is a bit of an issue because certain vocations don't necessarily get good until they have certain core skills and certain regular skills unlocked. Again, this seems to be something that Dragon's Dogma 2 is looking to improve by adding more core skills earlier on, and I'm honestly looking forward to that and seeing how it changes the general reception of the early game and the early combat for Dragon's Dogma. But for the original game and the Dark Arisen expansion, it remains a very glaring weakness that looks to be something that they have decided to rectify. Overall, I do feel that the game has a lot of good aspects to it, but also has a lot of glaring flaws, some of which I'm not even touching on at the moment just because there are so many things that the game does well, and there are so many that it does so poorly that it kind of drags the game down. I am very adamant in my stance that I feel it is very much a well put together 6 out of 10 game with some 7 and 8 out of 10 moments. However, the issues definitely bring it down, especially the slower start and the issue with player retention because of the easy access to the expansion DLC and the Ox Cart quest, as well as some of the more obtuse parts of questing where you might not know exactly where to go or might not exactly know that you missed something because as you progress main story quests, it changes the game stage and you lose access to certain side quests when you progress the game stage, and the game doesn't tell you this, it doesn't warn you about this. It's all part of the consequence, which is a wonderful design in concept. However, for most players, they want to be able to do everything. They don't want to miss anything, and you're not told that game stages are a thing. You're not told that you'll lose access to certain quest lines, and unfortunately, it's just one of the many issues that people seem to drop the game over. But once more, I do think the game is phenomenal. It's worth playing. I've played it for nearly 12 years at this point, and it has been one hell of a journey, one hell of a ride, and I am hoping to experience the same things that I did with the original game when Dragon's Dogma 2 releases in March. However, I myself am personally nearing the end of my journey with Dragon's Dogma. It has been a wonderful experience over the past 11 years that I have been playing it on and off. I've accomplished a lot of things that I've set out to do. There are still a couple that I would like to attempt, such as getting a sub 13-minute speedrun for my own personal goal. I highly recommend anyone that is on the fence for this game to give it a try. there's not much to lose. You can usually catch it on sale for about $5, and even if you only play the game to experience the main story and how goofy it is at times, it is a worthy investment. So I would like to thank everyone who has encouraged me to make this video here and challenge myself a little bit, and I would like to thank anyone who has actually taken the time to watch this entire thing and given me a chance. So thank you to anyone and everyone who is watching this and who has supported me. And for now, au revoir, Dragon's Dogma.